Hello and welcome to another Daily Record live stream in which we look back at the main events of the last 5 days. The Scottish Parliament and Westminster are both in recess, so it's not been the busiest of weeks compared to what's gone on earlier this month. Joining me, Paul Hutcheon, the political editor of the Daily Record, is Torcull Crichton, our revered Westminster editor, and also Chris McCall, our equally revered deputy political editor. So before we discuss the main items of the week, I think I want to come to you, Chris. You nearly broke Twitter this week. A tweet about Nadine Dorries in Glasgow, if I recall, which attracted a monumental 50,000 likes at least. Do you want to talk us through that?
Well, as I'm sure you'll all be watching the Commonwealth Games. They've started in Birmingham this week. And Nadine Dorries, she was on BBC Breakfast yesterday morning celebrating that fact. You know, she is the UK government's Minister for Sport after all, so it's only right that she should be in Birmingham promoting the Games. Which is great for Birmingham and the West Midlands. I mean, I spent some time working in Birmingham and it's a fantastic city, so I am genuinely pleased to see the Commonwealth Games take place there. But Nadine Dorries, she did appear to forget that Glasgow last hosted the Games as the last UK city to host the Games in 2014. When she was asked about the Birmingham event, she said, well, I am paraphrasing here before people dig me up on quotations, but she basically said this is the biggest event in the UK, biggest sporting event in the UK since the London Olympics in 2012. And I think more than a few people, interpreted that as Nadine Dorries either forgetting or choosing to forget about the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow in 2014, which, you know, were a big deal. There were some really big names at those games, like Usain Bolt. He took part at Hampden Park. And obviously, it was the biggest sporting event ever held in Scotland. So I think a few people were slightly cheesed off at Nadine Dorries for saying that. And I should say, in fairness to Nadine, she isn't the only person that's made that mistake. There's been a few instances of BBC News and Channel 4 News where the presenters have kind of assumed that the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham are the first major athletics event to take place in the UK since the London Olympics, which of course is not the case. So, don't forget Glasgow, I think, is the main message here.
Let's cut to the chase. Did it actually get you any more followers?
Slightly, a few dozen, which I'm sure I'll lose as soon as I tweet about, my usual mix of Scottish politics and the woes of Hibernian football clubs. So, yeah, we'll see how long they stick around for.
Well, I think that's got mute conversation written all over it. I think you probably get more abuse than the new followers. So let's move on from this historic tweet onto more substantive issues. Torcull, the Tory leadership, we are where we were last week. It's still Sunak versus Truss. And let's face it, it looks like it's going to be Liz.
Yeah, when you said substantive issues, I thought you were going to ask me about Rooney versus Vardy, which has just come out today as well. That's gone to the script. And so is the Truss versus Sunak Tory leadership debate. She's well ahead. Sunak has been torpedoed this morning by Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary's come back in on the side of Truss. A kind of drive-by shooting in the newspapers. Wallace wrote a piece. I don't know if he used a pen or a machine gun to write it, but basically taking down Sunak, saying he stood in his way when he was trying to increase defence spending, saying that he walked out in the middle of a crisis on Boris Johnson, and saying that Truss will hit the ground running. She has an international presence. She knows how the Treasury works. She can control inflation. So that almost seals the deal with a month to go, you think, if the polls stay like this. Sunak had a very short time to turn this round to become the favourite. He's made a classic error of trying to look prime ministerial and talk to the nation, to the country, whereas she's focus grouped it to death and is talking to the people that count right now, the Tory membership who will be voting on this within days when their ballot papers arrive.
I mean, it's been a really dismal leadership contest, given that they're appealing to 160,000 people. They're focusing on a bunch of niche issues like inheritance tax now and other such issues. I was going to say it's the the worst leadership contest I've ever covered, but bear in mind I've covered several Scottish Lib Dem leadership contests.
And Labour ones as well in Scotland. There's been a few of them.
Well,
but enlivened this week by Kate McCann taking down the studio set with her when she fainted midway through one of the debates. She's thankfully fine, but that curtailed one of the debates. They didn't really get into each other. But the one last night, the one in Leeds, my goodness, Liz Truss had come on leaps and bounds. I don't know which Stanislavski school of method acting she'd gone to in the last few days, but she just looked relaxed. She looked comfortable in her own skin. She had the winner's advantage of, she had that feeling of momentum. Sunak 1 point for standing up for himself, for saying he was right to walk out on Johnson, for maintaining this line that there has to be a reduction in inflation before you start introducing tax cuts. But he's not on the front foot. She is. She looks like by the time we come to the conference season, by Monday, the 5th of September is when the result will be declared. It looks like we'll have a new Prime Minister, a new female Prime Minister, Tory Prime Minister, the third female Tory Prime Minister of the modern era.
Chris, 2 key issues have come up in this contest. One is tax cuts. Obviously, Liz Truss wants to go faster, sooner. Sunak is much more cautious and wants to postpone tax cuts until inflation is tamed. And the other issue is the downfall of Boris Johnson and Sunak's role in that. What do you think the main issue is that explains Truss's pretty chunky lead and likely victory?
I think, the central issue here is that Rishi Sunak, amongst Conservative Party members, and remember, Conservative Party members are the only people right now who can choose who the next Prime Minister is. There is a perception that Sunak led the rebellion against Boris Johnson, which ultimately caused him to resign as well, when he will eventually resign. He is still Prime Minister now. But is that really fair? You could argue that Boris Johnson was the architect of his own downfall. But the perception is certainly amongst Tory Party members that Rishi Sunak stabbed him in the back, encouraged other cabinet members to resign or threaten to resign, and other Tory MPs to leave government jobs. So Sunak is basically paying the price amongst the Tory Party membership, where Boris Johnson remains very, very popular. I think there are a lot of Tory Party members who would be quite happy if Boris Johnson turned around today, tomorrow, and said, you know what, guys, actually, I'm going to hang around. I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to carry on in Downing Street. I think a lot of Tory Party members would be delighted if he said that. Obviously, not suggesting that Boris Johnson is actually going to do that. Will he mount a campaign, a comeback in future years? Don't think you could rule that out, but he will be leaving Downing Street, and we are going to get a new Prime Minister. And right now, that's absolutely, almost certainly going to be Liz Truss. You just really can't see a way back for Rishi Sunak to overtake her popularity amongst the Conservative base, as Torcull mentions. She's kind of grown into this campaign. She looks increasingly confident and self-assured. She kind of looks like, that she will be the Prime Minister in waiting. And Rishi Sunak, what the future holds for him, well, only he knows.
Torcull, you made the point that Sunak has tried to appeal more to voters and the country, whereas Truss has appealed more to party members. And I've lost count of the number of leadership contests where the person who appeals to the members ends up winning. But if Truss does end up as the next Prime Minister, what do you think Labour will think about that? And do you think she'll be a hostage to some of the promises that she's made to the 160,000 Tory party members?
Well, our big promise is to cut tax and to reverse that national insurance rise that Sunak put in for the NHS and for social care in England. So she's going to have to borrow to do that. She'll have no problem doing that. She's promised it now. I think Labour were delighted last week, that they would have taken either Sunak or Truss and thrashed either one of them, or so they thought. But that turnaround last night, and it's worth going back to watch it or get the excerpts on your news channel, that shows that she can perform. Wallace, when he came and defended her today, came out and said she may not be the slickest of performers, but she gets things done. And she'll get a bounce when she goes in. All new prime ministers and leaders do. And I wouldn't underestimate her. Labour were laughing last week, that when she gets in, she'll get a flick of a bounce. She'll cut taxes in an emergency budget. She'll appear strong, perhaps a little wooden. Theresa May was wooden. Starmer's wooden. And if she looks strong enough, she may put Labour actually on the back foot. What I remember most, there's two things. One is Ken Clarke going for the leadership many, many years ago and telling the Tory party what it needed to do for the country, and they would not listen to him. And the second thing is what I remember when Gordon Brown was ready, became Prime Minister and was ready to go for an election, and George Osborne, shallow, young, new Shadow Chancellor, went to the Tory conference and promised a cut in inheritance tax. I thought, well, that's going to do nothing. It switched the polls. It's not sufficiently to get rid of a Labour majority, but enough to frighten Gordon Brown out of not calling that election, which was fatal, of course, for Brown. So a lot of things can happen at conference season with a new Prime Minister coming in, setting the weather for the new political season in September.
Let's move on to what I think is the main story in Scotland this week, the ongoing tragedy of drug deaths in Scotland. Now, this has been a long-standing Daily Record campaign. We've got the highest rate of drug deaths in Europe, and new figures released yesterday showed that I think 1,330 poor souls had lost their lives to overdoses in 2021, a paltry reduction of 9 compared to the previous year. And I'll just show you the Daily Record splash this morning. This is it here, failed, with a picture of Nicola Sturgeon on the front. Now, to give you a bit of context, certainly the Scottish Government has tried to act on this crisis. They put more money into treatment services after, of course, cutting the budgets. They declared a public health emergency, and they set up a drug deaths task force. But do you not think, Torcull, given these things that the Scottish Government have done, it's simply not working?
Well, a reduction of 9 deaths from the previous year. And when you go through the report, you can look at some areas where the fatalities have gone up. Dumfries and Galloway, Fife, Lothian, Grampian, the fatalities have gone up. And of course, there's a death and a tragedy and grief for families behind each one of these statistics. Yes, they promised 250 million more. Yes, the Scottish Government set up a task force, which has reported, controversially, because it's they lost the chair of that task force before the report was due. 20 recommendations in it, over 100 actions that the UK and Scottish Government could take right now on this. And all that's got to play out. The money's got to get into the system and help people get off drugs. The biggest thing from the report, and I think it's beginning to happen across society, is to try and shift the culture away from penalising and criminalising addicts to treating them as medical cases that need support and a bit of compassion. Now, bang on the Daily Record, there's the power of print right there in your hand, Paul, that big failed headline. Everyone else piled in, the politicians piled in behind that, the opposition politicians, Douglas Ross, and calling for his bill, which would guarantee treatment for addicts to be taken up by the government. They all blamed Sturgeon. And Sturgeon admitted herself last year that she took her eye off the ball on this issue and shook up the ministers responsible for looking after drug abuse. But on an issue like this, it's endemic, and 4 times the UK average, one of the highest figures in Europe. It just feels like one of these issues where you want to play politics aside, and everyone put their shoulder to the wheel and just try and solve this. So that there should be kind of a multi-party, a cross-party effort, a cross-party agreement. There should be anyway, to try and move this on and turn these stats around. Maybe this is the peak. I mean, 1,330 and then slightly down 9. Maybe we'll see that going down over the next few years. Hopefully we will. But it's a tough nut to crack, and it needs everyone to help.
Chris, just to pick up a point that we mentioned in our leader this morning, see if these deaths were predominantly affecting middle-class areas in middle Scotland. Do you think that more work would be done in this area?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think when it comes to an issue like deaths from drugs, the people that you really have to listen to are not necessarily opposition politicians or even journalists like ourselves. We really need to speak to campaigners, charities that are dealing with people struggling with addiction in their day-to-day lives, people on the front line who know the reality. Because when you're talking about drug deaths and you're talking about 1,300 people, that can kind of seem like a faceless number, but it's important to remember that for every one of those people, you know, there will be loved ones left behind, and there'll be friends and family, and maybe, you know, if they're lucky, health support workers who are trying to help them turn a corner. And all of these people are kind of making the same point. They're saying, you know, we've had lots of warm words from the Scottish government in recent years. You know, this has been talked about, and action, actual hardline action to change things is too slow in coming. Now, the Scottish government, I'm sure they would argue that, you know, they have listened and they are trying to make changes and they have committed money, but these things are going to take time. It's going to take a while before we see substantial reductions in the numbers of deaths that we're seeing. But if you look at the reaction to campaigners to yesterday's announcement, I mean, they're all over today's Daily Record. You know, they're just, the disappointment is evident. You know, they're saying this strategy isn't working, and, you know, we don't have time to wait much longer. Like the Daily Record's chief reporter, Mark McGovern, who's done, you know, so much great reporting on this issue, he said that the statistics announced yesterday are possibly the most depressing yet. And what he means by that is that, you know, the Scottish government has woken up to this issue, and effectively we haven't seen any difference in the number of deaths. You know, you mentioned yourself, it's just a single-digit decline, which statistically is no reduction at all, really. We're kind of stuck where we are. And, you know, the attitude and the kind of thoughts amongst campaigners right now is like, we're kind of stuck, so something has to change. And what is it? Where do we go from here, basically?
Yeah, Torcull, I mean, there's no silver bullet in this. There's no one thing that you can, no one lever you can pull and the drug death figure will go down. The Daily Record has called for decriminalisation. We've called for legal consumption rooms. Both things still appear to be a work in progress. But there's also this Douglas Ross bill, Douglas Ross being the Scottish Tory leader, the Right to Recovery bill, which is going through Holyrood just now, which the Scottish government are still not backing. Now, clearly the Record is not a huge fan of the Tories, but do you think that the Douglas Ross bill will be getting a second hearing at this stage?
Well, the drug abuse issue and addiction and the deaths is one of these problems where you throw everything at the wall and just see what sticks, and just try different solutions, because, you know, not some things will work, some things won't work, and I say there's no magic solution. There is one solution, of course. That's money. Money for rehab rather than prisons, money to get people help and support, because, you know, fighting addiction is difficult. It's something that somebody has to do individually with a lot of support, and it's a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly battle for people to try and recover. And Douglas Ross's bill, guaranteeing a level of support for addicts who self-present or are presented by their GPs to addiction services, would go some way, but it has to be backed up by commitment. It seems to be there seems to be a cross-party commitment to getting something done, but it needs cash as well, which is maybe why the Scottish government has held back so far in backing. Plus, it's a highly politicised debate. As I said at the beginning, people tearing lumps out of the First Minister over this because they see it as a failure of her, personal failure of hers, because she had been being distracted by other things, i.e. independence, the Tories and Labour and Lib Dems will say. So if it could be de-escalated, decontaminated a little bit politically, and just everybody get together and agree that treatment and cash are the biggest plasters you can put on this.
Yeah, well, let's hope that this time next year we're looking at much more positive figures and a much steeper reduction in drug deaths. Another issue I want to talk about is the resignation of former Labour frontbencher Sam Tarry. Not the resignation, the sacking of Sam Tarry over his attendance at a picket supporting the rail strikers. Now, Torcull, obviously it's been spun as a resignation about attending a picket line. Keir Starmer himself has said that it was about breaching collective responsibility and saying things on the TV that he shouldn't have. I mean, what's your reading of the Tarry row?
I'd reverse what you just said. I mean, the spin is that he was sacked as he wasn't shadow transport secretary. That's Louise Haig, so he was kind of promoting himself a little bit there. He shadowed buses minister, and Starmer says he was sacked for speaking out of turn, speaking without authority on wage policy and inflation, which weren't in line with agreed Labour policy. The real reason he was sacked, of course, is because he defied Keir Starmer's order to his shadow cabinet not to appear on picket lines. Starmer wants Labour to look like a government in waiting, and government ministers, SNP government ministers, Tory government ministers don't appear on picket lines. Why would Labour shadow government ministers, he says. I think that's been a huge error. He set himself up for failure there, because there are plenty shadow cabinet members, senior shadow cabinet members, who are more than willing, would want to, whose instinct, whose very motivation for being in politics is to help people and advance the cause of ordinary working people who, nobody strikes lightly. But so when you're on a picket line, any support you get is welcome. So Starmer, well, it could go either way. He's set himself up for a battle with the left and with the trade unions. We've seen Aslev and the head of Aslev in Scotland saying he's ripped up his membership card and would want Aslev to disaffiliate from the Labour Party. That tension exists anyway between Labour and the unions as Labour moves to the right. But if it starts kind of infecting the shadow cabinet itself over this long summer of strikes, everyone's going to be out. BT workers, teachers, council workers, bin men, more rail strikes. There's going to be a lot of disruption this summer and autumn. And if Starmer finds himself on one side of that picket line with his shadow cabinet, or some members of his shadow cabinet on the other, he's going to be in trouble for a battle he need not have had. I mean, Starmer is pulling Labour into the centre and to the right quickly enough without having this fight.
Just to challenge you there, I mean, you think it's spin that he wasn't fired over the picket line appearance, but there were other folk who appeared on. No,
he was. Starmer says he was fined because he spoke out of turn. He was really fined because he was on the picket line.
Yeah, no, well, that's I suppose what I take issue with. I mean, other shadow ministers had done the same over the past few weeks and weren't fired. I mean, if you look at what he said on Sky, if you just to read what he said on Sky, this is Sam Tarry. He basically he was talking about inflation uprated increase. He said every worker deserves a pay rise that is in line with inflation. Now, that is not Labour policy. I mean, he may wish it was, but that is not what Rachel Reeves has been saying. And so I think that Mr. Tarry gave Keir Starmer an opportunity to fire him in ways that he would have found it more difficult to sack others on the front bench.
And he wanted that because Sam Tarry wanted that, didn't he? Because a working class hero is something to be. That's what the song says. And Sam Tarry, of course, is in a little local difficulty in Ilford South. There are moves to say.
Are you trying to suggest that maybe his resignation was somehow to do with his reselection battle?
Well, he certainly upped his profile a lot, and he'll have motivated his activists in his constituency now to perhaps support his reselection, which is going to a ballot. He's been triggered. There's a ballot for his reselection as the Labour candidate and MP the next time. So he'll have done himself no harm there, of course. But like you said, other whips, Labour whips have been on picket lines, but of course they didn't speak out. And in Scotland, we've seen Monica Lennon express solidarity with Sam Tarry. We've seen Labour MSPs on the picket line, and the leader of the Scottish Labour Party even was on. I think he expressed support with Edinburgh rail strikers last month as well. So Scotland proving itself different, using this rail strike to prove itself different. The left using the rail strike to give itself a distinction from Starmer, and vice versa. Starmer might be quite pleased, actually, to have a bit of a Barney with the left wing, just to show these voters in the sacred middle ground of Britain that he's their man.
Just a final issue we're going to cover, Chris, the Jordan Linden scandal. Up until a couple of days ago, Jordan Linden was the SNP leader of North Lanarkshire Council. Our sister paper, the Sunday Mail, splashed a story at the weekend about sexual harassment allegations against him from a couple of years ago in Dundee. Now, the SNP initially responded by trying to pour scorn over the story and threatening the paper with IPSO, which is the industry regulator, if you want to make a complaint about a newspaper. A couple of days later, they put out another statement in Linden's name, basically him resigning and apologising for his conduct a few years ago. So just generally, Chris, what do you make of the SNP's handling of this scandal?
I think if I was an SNP member, I would be concerned by the way this affair has been handled. I mean, ultimately, those who follow Scottish politics quite closely, they might have found that the Jordan Linden resignation, struck them as quite familiar with previous stories that the Daily Record has covered, such as the case of former SNP MP Patrick Grady. And ultimately, when it comes to issues of complaints made against senior party members about anything, there needs to be confidence in the system. If you are a rank and file member and you feel that you've been wronged by somebody more senior, it takes an aspect of bravery to come forward and say, look, I feel I have been wronged here. I think something bad has happened and I would like something to be done about it, or at very least be investigated properly. And I think there will be some party members who, given the Jordan Linden case, given the Patrick Grady case, they might not think that. They might think, if I step forward, if I put my head above the parapet, so to speak, maybe, this isn't going to get resolved in a proper way. And I'm sure the SNP would absolutely refute that. But, questions definitely have been asked of the way the parties handle complaints. And it's up to the party to respond to that.
Torcull, do you think that if you look at the Jordan Linden case and Patrick Grady case, is there a growing perception that when complaints or at least allegations are made of this nature, that the instincts of the SNP are to protect the politicians, to protect the elected members?
Well, the SNP certainly have had plenty of practice in responding to this kind of scandal and allegation, from the Derek Mackay case, where he had to stand down as Finance Secretary of the Scottish Parliament, Patrick Grady, who is still an SNP MP, and now this Linden case as well. Now, you can't say there's a pattern in the party. These things happen in society in general as well. But how the party has responded has been to be defensive, first of all. And I think we've seen with other scandals and other allegations of abuse that institutions tend to be defensive of themselves and the perpetrator of the abuse, or the alleged perpetrator of the abuse, first of all, before they open themselves up and take seriously the allegations of the alleged victims. So, yeah, there are big lessons to be learned, and which you'd think by now, given how the party has had to handle these things time and time again, and seen it in other institutions as well, with churches and other parts of society, that there would be just a better way of dealing with this within the party. I mean, be that as it may, he's gone now, leaving a gap in the council there and the leadership, and just leaving another mark. I don't think SNP members will be looking at the way the party has handled it. I think they'll be looking slightly askance and saying, how much more of this, can we take? It doesn't do any party's image any good to have this kind of story circulated about it.
Chris, finally, I mentioned that when the Sunday Mail published their exclusive, the SNP mentioned IPSO, and then, of course, with the Grady case, there was the famous leaked recording in which Ian Blackford urged fellow MPs to show Grady support without mentioning the victim a single time. Do you think that there are going to be increased calls for a sort of root and branch review of how the SNP deals with its own complaints?
I think so, and they have been from opposition politicians, as you'd expect, and to a much lesser degree from some SNP members themselves. I mean, the leaked recording that you refer to, obviously we don't know who was responsible for that. That obviously was a group of SNP MPs speaking, they thought, privately about Patrick Grady and his return to the SNP benches in the House of Commons. But the leaking of that was, disastrous for the Westminster group of SNP MPs. It's really undermined Ian Blackford's authority, and we can only presume that whoever recorded it and ultimately leaked it, that was the intention. But it was interesting from that recording, and Amy Callaghan, one of the SNP's youngest MPs, she was speaking out in favour of Patrick Grady and supporting him and saying, let's welcome him back. But when the recording came out, she was pretty quick to issue a statement apologising, saying, look, I do take, victims, and anyone that comes forward with allegations, against anyone, I take this seriously. Because I think she realised, the gravity of what that, leaked recording was going to do to the party. Ian Blackford, however, it could charitably be said that maybe he was slow off the mark to respond to that. And I think really, there are still question marks over Ian Blackford's handling of the Patrick Grady case that still have not been answered or resolved. And I think really it's up to him and the Westminster Party to kind of get to grips with that, really.
That's great. I think that pretty much wraps it up. If we just do some housekeeping, some plugs. If you want to follow the Daily Record politics team on Twitter, then please go to the handle @record_politics. We've also got a Facebook group for Record Politics. And if you want to sign up to our newsletter, you can do that through the Twitter handle as well. So thanks very much for tuning in to this latest live stream. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again next week.